here. So we'll get started shortly.
Welcome, Marshall.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hello. That was quick, Lincoln. It was like time travel.
How do you mean? Oh, to go from LA.
First you were somewhere else and then instantly you were at the quad.
Yeah, from LA to it's the new Hyperloop from LA
Yeah.
to Palo Alto.
I guess we got the high-speed rail back.
Okay, I think we can get started. So good morning and welcome to the January meeting of the City Council's SCAP Ad Hoc Committee. I'm Brad Eggleston, Director of Public Works for Palo Alto. Our usual housekeeping things, we'll record the meeting and we will post it later to the city's website, and we'll send a link out following the meeting. We're also streaming it live on YouTube, and you'll see you can ask questions or make comments in the Zoom Q&A function. We have staff who will be trying to answer those questions during the meeting. But if we're unable to get to a question during the meeting, we will keep track of them and answer them later and post those. Onto the agenda, please. So this is the agenda for today's meeting. We're going to have a quick review of the December meeting that focused on mobility and land use. Then we'll have presentations covering wildfire impacts and sea level rise and the actions that are being taken by the city to address both of those areas. We will pause after the wildfire presentation for questions and comments from the committee members and our working group. But toward the end of the meeting, we will have an opportunity for public comment. And somewhere in there, probably right in the middle, we'll also take a short break. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to our sustainability manager, Christine Wong.
Thank you, Brad, and good morning, everyone. So a quick recap from our December SCAP ad hoc meeting. We had a lot of great conversation and questions and comments from the public. Most of the questions covered the following themes of, how can the city encourage active transportation? How can we make bicycling safer? What are the assumptions that we're using around commuters, and whether or not we've studied land use and housing preferences. And we've got a lot of suggestions covering themes around providing viable alternatives to driving, that safety is the biggest barrier to people getting on their bikes, that we should take the lessons learned from our very successful Safe Routes to Schools program and apply them to all residents, that we need to enhance the SCAP and make it, bring it to the attention of every major decision that City Council makes, and that we need to forward on both affordable as well as mixed income and middle income housing. So that's the quick recap from December, and that meeting can be watched on our YouTube sustainability playlist. Now we will hear from Marshall Burke and Michael Wera from the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment on the impacts of wildfires. We are lucky to have them due to the efforts of Mark Hofberg, who's a longtime Palo Alto resident. He was able to make the connection for us. Marshall is an associate professor in the Department of Earth Systems Science, the deputy director at the Center on Food Security and Environment, and center fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a co-founder of Atlantis AI, a remote sensing startup. His research focuses on social and economic impacts of environmental change and on measuring and understanding economic development in emerging markets. And Michael is a lawyer and scholar focused on climate and energy policy. He's the director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program and a senior research scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, where he provides fact-based, bipartisan, technical, and legal assistance to policymakers engaged in the development of novel climate, energy law, and regulation. He also facilitates the connection of Stanford faculty with cutting-edge policy debates on climate and energy, leveraging Stanford's energy and climate expertise to craft real-world solutions to these challenges. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Michael and Marshall.
Great, thanks a lot, Christine. I'm going to start out. So I'm Marshall Burt. Great to be here. Thanks for having us. I want to start out by sort of framing the problem and looking at some data, basically, that my group and others have worked on to show how quickly wildfire risk is changing. For a lot of us in Palo Alto, that means not direct exposure to flames, but more likely exposure to wildfire smoke. And so that's what a lot of my research is on, is trying to understand who's exposed to what and what impact is it having on our families, on our communities, on our children, things like that. So I'm going to start by sort of framing what we're up against, and then Michael's going to tell us what to do about it. So that's our tag team here. So I'll start by showing you just a few slides, and again, hopefully enough to get the discussion going. Find my PowerPoint. Here we go. All right. Hopefully, folks can see that. Okay, first on, so this will be largely focused on wildfire smoke. I think everyone is cognizant of the large uptick in overall wildfire activity that we've seen in recent years. And I really want to emphasize how just dramatically quickly this has changed over time. And really, again, just in the last 5 to 10 years. So both on the wildfire side, the amount of area that's burning, and then on the smoke side, which is what I'll focus on, the amount of smoke that's being put up into the air and then pushed by wind around the state and around the country. So that uptick is driven by a confluence of factors. It's driven by a century of fire suppression. We've been putting fires out instead of letting them burn. It's been driven by many more people moving into the wildland-urban phase, wildland-urban interface, the WUI, and finally by a warming climate that has dried out fuels and made them much more flammable. So those are sort of the confluence of the three main factors driving that. And what's happened then again is it's led to a large increase in smoke exposure from these fires. Here's a map of the increase in what we call smoke days per year. This is basically a satellite derived estimate of whether or not there's smoke in the air. Sort of one of our best data sources on who's exposed to what in terms of wildfire smoke. And this has gone up really dramatically. So we have good data back to about 2005. So this is the last 15 years. And basically, we've seen nearly a 5 to 6 day increase per year. So almost a week of additional smoke per year over the last decade or so in the part of the country where we live. So California has really been hit hardest here. And the uptick has just been dramatic. So if you can see the plot in the upper right here, this is sort of the time trend of the number of days annually with smoke in the air. And again, it's gone up, by a factor of 3 or factor of 4 just in the last decade, right? So dramatic increase. Okay, what does that mean? That has meant that smoke now contributes, especially in the worst years like 2018 and 2020, more than half of our overall annual air pollution, right? So if you add up the amount of total exposure to air pollution across the year for your average person in Palo Alto, 2018, 2020, wildfire smoke was more than half of the total air pollution that we're exposed to, right? And that's up from like 10 to 15% a decade ago, right? So just again, a dramatic shift in wildfire's contribution to overall air quality. So if anyone's interested in the science here, happy to share the papers on which this is based. This is a paper we had about last year looking at these trends. Here I'm showing you maps of if you're not used to thinking in that we measure particulate matter in micrograms per cubic meter is basically the amount of the particles in a given amount of airspace. And so that's what this is measuring and showing just a dramatic increase around the country, but really in much of the West in the contribution of smoke to overall annual air pollution. Okay. Breathing smoke and breathing dirty air overall is bad for us. We know that. What we and others are uncovering is that it's worse for us than we thought, and the impacts extend beyond just health impacts. Health impacts are important. These have been looked at a lot. We continue to look at them, and the idea is sort of that every stone you look under, in terms of health impacts, you tend to find an impact. So on the left here is a study we published using the universe of births in California. So we have amazingly rich data. We have all the birth certificates in California. We know where the babies were born. We know when they were born. We can match them to the smoke they were exposed to in utero. So I have 9-year-old twins who were born in 2012. They are in this data set. So I'm happy to contribute in a citizen science way to the data here. What we study is, do you see an increase in the likelihood of preterm birth when kids are exposed in utero to more smoke exposure? And indeed we do. We see a pretty dramatic increase, and it's large enough that the effect size is large enough to account for thousands of additional preterm births in California every year. So our data here don't go through the most smoky years. We only have the birth certificates 2006 to 2012 right now. We're trying to get the newer data. So this is in even a less smoky era. 2008 was the smokiest year in our data. Again, these are just California data. And there we saw that smoke accounted for something like 6% of total excess births, excess preterm births across California. That is a lot. That is a very large number. And it's large because preterm births are very costly to society, right? Estimates are it costs $50,000 or $100,000 additionally for society for every preterm birth in terms of additional medical care, additional educational resources, et cetera. Okay, so that's an example of a health impact. The health impacts extend far beyond that. This is just one we've worked on. Okay, we're also finding that there are important impacts, not just in the health domain, but also in other domains that we care about. So other research has suggested a cognitive link to pollution exposure more broadly. What we have looked at here is how kids do on standardized tests as a function of how smoky it was during the year in which they were studying for that test. And we see a very strong downward sloping relationship between more smoke exposure on school days. There's no effect on non-school days. It's only on school days. So this suggests the effect is real. More smoke exposure and worse performance on standardized tests. And we see this actually for that there are larger effect sizes in more disadvantaged communities, which is important to think about. But we also see effect size, meaningful effects in wealthier communities like the ones we live in. So this is a burden that is shared relatively broadly. Okay, so large negative consequences, they extend beyond health. That's the outdoor environment. So I think we're very used to thinking about sort of smoke as an outdoor phenomenon, right? We measure ambient, so ambient, another word for outdoor air quality a lot. That's what our sensors tend to measure. When we get the air now alerts, it's all about ambient air quality. It tells us to stay inside. Another thing we tried to do is to think carefully about the indoor environments. We spend 80 to 90% of our time indoors, most of that in our homes. And so the effect of changing outdoor exposure is really mediated by what happens inside our homes. And that historically has been very hard to study because people do not have monitors in their homes. It's very expensive to put high quality air monitors into people's homes. And so we have just not had good data to study this with. Okay, that has changed dramatically in the last few years with the advent of very high quality consumer grade air quality monitors. So what we're going to exploit here are these purple air monitors. If you haven't seen them, I'll show you a picture in a second of them. They're quite small. They're basically, you can hold one in your hands, and they're very high quality. They've been validated against the EPA monitors, basically the highest quality monitors we have. They're not perfect, but they're pretty darn good, and they cost a couple $100. And so especially Bay Area is like ground zero for people buying these purple air monitors. So here's a screen grab of Palo Alto, Menlo, and Mountain View, and you can see there are hundreds of people who have put these monitors both outside their homes. So the top plot here is the outside monitors, and for our purposes, what is really exciting, inside their homes. And And either knowingly or not, they are broadcasting these data to the world. We can go on the Purple Air website and download them. So this is a remarkable scientific resource. Okay, what do we find? I'm showing you a plot here of August 20th, 2021. This was a smoky day we had in 2021. The Bay Area in some sense got a little bit lucky in 2021. It was a big fire year, but we were less exposed to smoke than say in 2020. But we did have some bad days. So this was a bad day. So outdoor is in the top plot here from Purple Air is suggesting over 100 micrograms per cubic meter. Those are very, very high daily levels. These are what we would consider dangerous levels. And you can see that the exposure was very similar across these, across all the Purple Air monitors, right? Everyone right at about 100. Okay, now let's look inside people's homes. This is the bottom plot, right? You see remarkable variation in people's ability to protect themselves basically from this outside exposure, right? So the green dots here, Purple Air nicely colors these. Green is good, red is bad. So these green dots, so I live just off Sand Hill Road here. We were at about, I can't see my actual number. We were at about 12 to 15 micrograms. So we were doing all right. We had our filters cranking on this day. I wasn't letting my kids open the windows, et cetera. So we were doing all right. Some people were doing better. Here are folks down at 2 micrograms. But you look elsewhere, right? In Allied Arts, in various parts of Palo Alto, very wealthy communities, they were doing terribly, right? They had terrible indoor air during this period. So why is that, right? And I guess number one, can we understand? So is this just idiosyncratic? Were they just bad on that day, or overall are they bad? And then what's causing that variation, right? Is it differences in the housing quality? Is it difference in some people's awareness? What's causing that? So that's what we want to understand. So what we can do is go house by house and estimate using all the data we have. If outdoor PM goes up by 1 unit, how much does indoor PM go up by? We're going to call this the infiltration rate, basically how much of the outdoor stuff gets inside. And here again, looking across all those houses I just showed you, we see remarkable differences on average. So not just on one day, this is looking across years of data for each house. We see 10x differences, 10-time differences in the amount of outdoor PM that's getting in, right? And again, this is across a sample of pretty similar houses, right? This is looking in Palo Alto and Menlo and Mountain View, and tends to be the wealthier communities that can afford this, right? And so we've tried to then, so we can estimate this infiltration rate, and we tried to understand, is it correlated with something? Is it the wealthier houses that are able to seal themselves off better? Is it the newer houses, et cetera? It's surprisingly uncorrelated with income. So we cannot predict this variation with income. We do not see, again, that wealthier houses are somehow doing a better job on average than lower income households. And we can't do it by housing value. We observe a lot about the house. We can't do it by house size. So to us, it seems like it has much more to do with the behaviors that people undertake that are hard for us to observe, and likely the filtration that they have inside their house. Some people have invested a lot in filtration, others haven't. So second to last slide here, let me just show you the implications of these differences, okay? So again, take the Bay Area, take everybody who has put a Purple Air monitor in their house and split them into 2 buckets, okay? One is a low infiltration bucket, houses that for whatever reason are doing a good job at sealing themselves off. And another is a high infiltration bucket. And often these houses are literally next to each other, right? They're just doing something different, and one is doing a very good job and the other is not. Okay, let's then look back for those 2 sets of houses across the August and September 2020 terrible smoke event, which I'm sure everyone remembers, right? It was sort of apocalyptic skies for weeks at a time. And let's compare the outdoor exposure for those 2 buckets of houses and the indoor exposure. Okay, the outdoor exposure here is at the top. So along the horizontal axis here is time, right? So we start in August 8th, we got the big lightning storm, a bunch of fires around the state started, a bunch of smoke was pouring into the Bay Area, right? And we start to get really high levels. And then early September were these sort of orange, dark brown skies, the sort of apocalypse days, if you remember it. Okay, so the red is the high infiltration guys, the blue is the low infiltration guys. In terms of outdoor air quality, in terms of ambient air quality, they look identical, right? Same exposure to outdoor air quality. So the exact same outdoor air quality event generated, again, remarkably different indoor air quality, right? And so here's the difference in indoor air quality. Again, the red is the high infiltration guys, the blue is the low infiltration guys. And if you add it up across that entire month and a half, what you see is up to a 20 times difference in total cumulated indoor exposure. So often what we care about is the cumulative exposure, and we see 20x differences. So again, massive, massive differences, which as best we can tell is due to differences in behavior and differences in what people are doing for filtration. Okay, so this is a hypothesis more than a finding, I would say. This is something we are working on as we go forward and looking for community organizations to partner with anywhere we can find them. So would love your thoughts on that. But our view is that if we're going to solve this problem, some people are clearly doing a good job. Just having information is not enough. It's important for understanding what the exposure is, but it's clearly not enough because we see a lot of people with these nice purple air sensors who have terrible indoor air quality, right? They're basically perfectly informed and they're still doing a terrible job. So information is not enough. What's pretty important is other technologies we think that can limit indoor exposure. And so this is there are now, luckily, in the past few years, many different types of indoor filtration devices that we can buy. They work pretty well. I have 3 indoor air monitors in my house now. I do, when the kids are at school, I do experiments with my various filters in various rooms in the monitors, and they can do quite well. When we don't have those, we need to think about other ways to limit our exposure. There's a new set of research findings thinking about masks. Luckily, we're pretty used to wearing masks right now, and if we wear the high quality ones, they can actually help a lot in terms of reducing our exposure. So to me, that's promising. Academics, it's almost cliche, will say we need more research on this. This is actually an area where we still do need more research. We need to understand exactly what we need to do in terms of filtration and in terms of masking to really limit our exposure. And if these things work really well, we need to figure out how to get them into the hands of everyone who needs them, right? I can easily go out on my Stanford salary and buy these and put them in my kids' rooms. Other people are not so lucky, right? And so we need to figure out how to get this, again, into the hands of everyone, not just the Stanford faculty. Okay, I will stop there and hand it off to Michael, who's going to tell us what to do about all this.
Thanks, Marshall. That was fantastic. Let me just pull up my slides real quick. And where are they? Darn it.
Hey, Christine, I saw a lot of questions in the chat here. You want to should we do them all as a whole when Michael's done, or you want me to respond to some of those now? What's best?
Sorry, you can respond to them now in the Q&A box if you.
Okay, I'll just respond in the, yeah, sure.
I'm just trying to find the right window here. Hopefully. Just 1 second. So thanks very much for having me. I'm just going to talk about, cover some similar topics to Marshall, but much more briefly, and then talk about, what the legal and policy barriers are to achieving change that might actually affect the smoke drifting over Santa Clara County and the city of Palo Alto. I think it's important to have a framing of the wildfire challenge that really tracks what Marshall described, and that is that the wildfire challenge is really not about acres burned. It's certainly that matters, forests burning matter, but this presentation, in terms of thinking of wildfire in terms of acres is really not the right way to think about the problem. And I think it's a very important place to start, to reject the kind of historic framing around how many acres, how many fires, and the trends in burned area, which are important, don't get me wrong, but they're not the pathway to a solution. I think we need to really be focused on people, the smoke impacts on people where they live, as Marshall mentioned, the effects on pregnant women and their babies, children, also senior citizens are probably the most vulnerable populations to wildfire smoke. And so we really need to be thinking about people. rather than acres. And we also need to be thinking about communities rather than acres. The campfire, which is probably the most notable, destructive, catastrophic wildfire in California history, wasn't a big fire, but it was significant for the same reason that the Oakland Hills fire was significant in the 1990s. It burned down an entire community. It was incredibly disruptive to the life and well-being of a town and the people that live there and the integrity of the place. And it still is to this day. And I'll just note, many homes were destroyed here and also in Santa Rosa, of course, in Northern California. And the impacts of that occur in a context which everyone in Palo Alto is familiar with, of a chronic shortage of housing. And that has had enormous impacts in the Chico region in terms of unsheltered population, where the unsheltered population in Chico was an issue prior to the campfire, but after the destruction of Paradise, when 20,000 structures were destroyed overnight, the homelessness problem in Chico really became totally unmanageable. It's had an enormous impact on local politics, complete turnover of the city council. And the Chico is actually one of the few communities under federal management because their homelessness policies have become so punitive that they've been held to violate constitutional restrictions on criminalizing being unsheltered. So the wildfire challenge is really about people, and it's about places, communities. And I think if we focus on that, the opportunities to move forward become clear. Part of the problem right now in terms of smoke is that we're really not focused on that. We're still focused in the places that generate the smoke too much on issues from another era. How much timber gets out of the woods in particular. Just to put some numbers on this, the value of timber sold from US federal lands in 2018, $267 million. That's pretty typical. It varies. It goes up and down by about $10 million a year. But in the mid 200 millions, the estimated value of smoke morbidity and mortality in California in 2018, by contrast, was $31 billion with a B. So priorities are out of whack, and we need to be thinking systematically about how to adjust them if we're going to get a handle on smoke and start to incorporate considerations of these regional, statewide, and westwide impacts of smoke emissions into the planning that's occurring where the smoke is being generated. Just like if we were downwind from a coal-fired power plant and Santa Clara County was exposed to the emissions from that coal-fired power plant, we'd be thinking about pollution controls on that coal-fired power plant. The challenge is that California has been in what I would call a fire drought for the better part of 150 years. And we need to change that situation without causing a fire flood. What we're getting right now is a fire flood. This image shows one researcher's estimate for federal lands, primarily, of the extent to which the natural fire regime is occurring, or there's too little fire or too much fire. Too little fire relative to the natural regime is in blue. Too much fire is in yellow to red. And so what we see here is that large parts of the Sierra and the coastal mountains of Northern California have had much less fire than prior to European settlement of California. Parts of Southern California are actually burning more than they used to, or at least than we think they used to, when Native American populations were the only residents. And that has a lot to do with, in the Southern California context, with the dense populations and just the fact that where you have a lot of people, you have a lot of ignitions. In the Sierra, the fire drought is primarily caused by the fire suppression policies, both removal of Native Americans who used to actively burn the landscape, and the fire suppression policies of the federal government and of CAL FIRE over the last 100 years. So how do we change the situation? Because what we're getting is a fire flood right now. Since 2015, the fire regime in the Sierra in particular has really changed in important and fundamental ways. And if you talk to the folks that are in charge of fire suppression, their perspectives on this issue are really changing. They grew up in an era, Tom Porter and other heads of CAL FIRE when fire suppression was an effective strategy, when they could really control the situation using large amounts of resources. CAL FIRE's Air Force is the envy of many countries. But that control is slipping away, and it's becoming more and more evident that there is not an ability to control fire under the current weather regimes. So I think getting back to or avoiding the flood that's coming at us, and the flood is caused by a number of reasons, but avoiding the flood that's coming at us really involves a recognition that a natural fire regime involves people. This is a member of the Yurok tribe engaged in cultural burning on their ancestral territories in Northern California. Historically, Yuroks and the Karoks and many other tribes, including the Muwekma which occupied the area around Stanford, were active cultural burners. They burned the landscape to keep it healthy and resilient, to make it safe to live in, and also because burning it provided a number of ecological benefits for them. We need to move in that direction, but 40 million people live in California now. And there's a lot of real estate that is not where we can't just light the forest on fire and allow good fire to exist in a simple way. However, the evidence strongly suggests that that using a combination of forest thinning and prescribed fire is the best way forward to reduce fire intensity, and so PM 2.5 emissions from forests when they burn. So this is a picture from the Bootleg fire of 2021. It was a big fire up in Oregon. It led to the shutdown of the California-Oregon interconnect, the big transmission line that gives us power from Oregon and Washington. In the top of the figure, you can see the no treatment area, where basically the Forest Service plantations were not modified in any way, and they got killed by the fire. I mean, nothing is alive. All the trees are dead, burnt sticks. In the middle of the figure is an area that the Nature Conservancy, in collaboration with native tribes, thinned and burned. And you can see that in that area, the fire intensity dropped considerably. The flame lengths were reduced. The fire dropped onto the forest floor and burned at low to moderate intensity. It's not that some of those trees aren't dead, a few of them are, but basically the stand is alive. And that means that PM 2.5 emissions from the fire in that zone were significantly reduced. In the bottom of the figure is an image of thinning only. And I think it's important to say thinning is not enough, right? You can see that the fire was less intense there than in the top part of the figure, but most of the trees are still dead. Fire intensity was still much higher than in the thinning plus prescribed fire part of the image. So we need to move at a landscape scale as quickly as we can toward this approach that involves active management by people in the Sierra, especially on U.S. Forest Service lands that have been planted and managed for timber harvest over the last 100 years. And I think this really, just stepping back to a high level really, requires some thinking and some careful thinking about how we engage with nature. Whether we think like Gifford Pinchot that we should manage nature for maximum kind of, to maximize societal extraction of resources, whether we think nature is something more like how John Muir conceived of it, that we should just leave it alone, keep our distance, right? Nature is a place without people, or whether we do need to move back toward a Native American approach to nature, which involves a lot of active management, but with an idea that that centers giving gifts to nature so that we may receive gifts in return, right? That's the way that Native Americans and Native Californians typically articulate their vision of their relationship with nature as one of reciprocity rather than resource extraction. And I think we need to really shift the paradigm in California if we're going to systematically reduce PM 2.5 emissions. So how might we do that? One aspect of, in the modern context, one aspect of change that I think does need to occur involves how we think about property ownership and the rights and responsibilities of property ownership. When do I, in my ownership of property and use of my property unreasonably interfere in your use and enjoyment of your property. This comes up a lot in a defensible space context, right? Where I might not maintain my defensible space and that could create a threat to your home burning down. But it also is important to consider in the fuels management and prescribed fire context. There's really no nuisance. It's very rare to see nuisance claims, let alone public nuisance claims, brought against landowners that fail to manage fuels on their environment, even though in the current climate change fuel context, they're creating a bomb on their property, essentially. And by contrast, prescribed fire, good fire, is often considered a nuisance because it creates smoke. And so we really need to be thinking about how to use the common law governance of property ownership to try to facilitate outcomes that we want and fully consider the impacts of different management of property so that everyone can enjoy the environments and the communities that they live in. Another place where I think we really do need to be looking at legal change is in how we manage air pollution under the Clean Air Act. Currently, in order to set a prescribed fire, you need to get an air permit from your local air control district because it's a pollution source. But wildfires are not considered an air pollution source. They're considered natural and what are called exceptional events. The Clean Air Act, as written in the 1970s, treats wildfire as kind of an act of God, and it allows the air pollution exceedances that occur during wildfires to be stripped out of the data that are used to evaluate whether an air district is in or is out of attainment. Now, there are reasonable concerns about including it in attainment considerations in the way that smokestacks are evaluated. Obviously, landscape scale wildfire PM is not as controllable as a smokestack. You can't just snap a scrubber on the end of the smokestack when you're talking about millions of acres of California forest. However, it is also the case that there's clear science and clear management prescription about how we could reduce these air pollution impacts. And so treating them as not reasonably controllable or preventable, or human caused but unlikely to recur, or natural. These are the terms in the statute that allow for designation of exceptional events. It's probably not reasonable either. It creates incentives to ignore them on the part of state, federal, and local air agencies, and most notably, the federal land managers that are leading to all of the negative impacts that Marshall just described and is evaluating. So we need to think about constructively how to make change in the Clean Air Act in a way that takes account of the difference between forests and traditional air pollution sources, but also takes account of our ability to control the outcome in the woods. So in conclusion, I think a key to the path forward is to focus on people and homes, not acres. We need to invest significantly at a scale needed to actually achieve goals in terms of reducing PM 2.5 exposure. I would emphasize that probably involves investing at the scale of multiple billions per year in fuels management in the Sierra. And we need to invest in other aspects that reduce our risks. Home hardening is really important, community protection, and of course, prescribed fire. And take a hard look at anti-forest science bias and structural racism in our environmental and resource management laws. We need to get back to thinking about the forest as a place where we invest rather than a place where we take from. And we need to think about how to put people responsibly back into the forest, stewarding it to reduce the impacts that we're observing in the present. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to hear from Nathaniel Rainey, the City of Palo Alto's Office of Emergency Services Coordinator.
You're on mute, Nathan.
And thank you. That never gets old, does it? So just give me a second to share my screen. And Christine, can you just confirm that I'm sharing my screen with you?
Confirmed.
Nathan, could you also speak up a little bit, please?
Yes, I sure will.
Thank you.
Problem. Okay, well, good morning. While I realize that Mayor Burt and Councilwoman Cormack, along with some of our city executive leaders, are more tuned into this topic, I realize there may be others who are not quite as familiar. So this will be a general description of our wildfire protection efforts. Our primary wildfire risk incorporates the wildfire urban interface. This is a zone of transition between wilderness and land developed by human activity, an area where a built environment meets or intermingles with the natural environment. In Palo Alto, the WUI encompasses the area east to west between essentially I-280 and Skyline Road and north to south within the Palo Alto jurisdictional boundaries. But there is a lot of WUI that surrounds Palo Alto, both to the west, north, and south. We are certainly impacted by incidents that occurred near us. As an example, in 2020, when we were almost directly exposed to the Santa Cruz fire. In our Palo Alto natural hazard risk profile, wildfires are considered a medium risk compared to higher rated risk we're exposed to, such as earthquakes and flooding. This geographic area contains not only a high density of valuable residential properties, but also critical public infrastructure as well that helps to inform that risk. Understanding the risk gives us an opportunity for mitigation. Mitigation is a process to eliminate or reduce the impacts of a known hazard. The city has a long track record of wildfire mitigation in our Foothills area. We manage this mitigation process currently with an interdepartmental team that consists of our Office of Emergency Services, the Fire Department, Public Works Department, Utilities Department, and the Community Services Departments. So staff members from each of these organizations work together to advance our wildfire mitigation efforts. One central activity of this group is to implement the Foothills Fire Management Plan, which directs a schedule of fire protection activities within the city-owned areas of the WUI. This plan is available online, and I have a slide of resource links coming up that I'll put up that you can look at, take a picture of, or whatnot if you're interested in learning more. It is informative to note that the Utilities Department has also recently developed a functional fire management plan directed by state law that outlines their wildfire mitigation strategies as a utility provider. Mitigation activities include our efforts in or around the Foothills and Arrasatero nature preserves, as outlined in our Foothills Fire Management Plan. There are more than 50 treatment areas, including portions of Page Mill Road, Arrasatero Road, and Los Trancos Road, that are on a multi-year cycle of maintenance. Vegetation management includes routine hand labor, such as pruning, weed whipping, deadwood debris removal, and mulching. Mechanical measures, such as disking and mowing. This work is managed primarily by our open space rangers at Foothills Nature Preserve, with assistance from our Public Works Urban Forestry Division. Tree removals, especially of non-native species like eucalyptus trees, and controlled burns or prescribed fires, are also vegetation management fuel reduction activities. We haven't done these in the recent past. However, we are assessing how to remove approximately 65 eucalyptus trees in Foothills and Arrasatero preserves at this time. Clearing city-owned electrical lines for vegetation in the WUI is an activity that is managed by our Urban Forestry Division in association with the Utilities Department to meet state vegetation and fire safety standards. To further protect this infrastructure, the Utilities Department has implemented a capital improvement program, project EL 21001 to underground 11 miles of electrical lines that run through the Foothills. To date, 1.4 miles have been completed, and this is an ongoing multi-year project. Defensible space, the process of reducing fuels in zones around the home, starts with a good home design. The city has a building inspection code for residential structures built within the WUI to reduce the likelihood of a home ignition. It also incorporates the best practices recommended by California Fire Services, CAL FIRE, which we support and promulgate on our wildfire webpage, cityofpaloalto.org/wildfire. Through this program, we encourage residents to not only harden the home against embers, but also to reduce the vegetation around and above the home to create defensible space zones. There are 3 zones, zone 0 to 5 feet from the home, which is an ember-free zone. Zone 1, which is 5 to 30 feet from the home. It's called a lean, clean, and green zone, where we try to remove a number of a number of amount of debris and clear the space so that fire won't walk up to the home. And then zone 2, which is 30 to 100 feet from the home, which is a reduced fuel zone where other fuel mitigation, fuel reduction activities are done. When you look at communities that have suffered wildfires, you'll see how successful these principles are in saving homes. It does take work to create these zones. There are some resources available from the Santa Clara County Fire Safe Council who can assist with defensible space surveys and provide chipping services. At this time, I'd like to highlight a few preparedness measures as I conclude my update to you before I field questions. One important way we prepare is in the interagency coordination that routinely occurs among the agencies and stakeholders involved with this threat, which includes CAL FIRE, Santa Clara County Fire, Stanford University, Mid-Penn Open Space, and the Los Altos and Woodside Fire Protection Districts. The Palo Fire Department also routinely deploys crews during wildfire season to wildfires in other parts of the state, providing us experienced and informed wildland personnel, as well as participating in annual wildfire training with county partners. In the late spring, early summer, fire department crews also perform hazardous fuels assessments of our residential properties in the Palo Alto Levee and provide mitigation measures and recommend mitigation measures to reduce their risk. We are exploring how to increase early warning of ignitions in the Levee. We have partnered with the Alert Wildfire Organization, a consortium of the University of Nevada, Reno, University of California, San Diego, and the University of Oregon, providing fire cameras and tools to help firefighters and first responders join other local agencies in establishing cameras in our area of responsibilities. There are currently cameras at Stanford University's Jasper Ridge and the Dish, at Black Mountain, at Foothills Park. We're in the process of establishing one at Montebello Reservoir. These cameras are publicly available for viewing at alertwildfire.org. Finally, I'd just like to remind folks, especially those that live in Dewey, about Ready, Set, Go. This is the CAL FIRE preparedness mantra for those who live at risk to wildfires. We also follow this model so that our Foothills residents can prepare ahead of time, following state and national best practices. Once again, available at cityofpaloalto.org/wildfires. So at this time, that concludes my prepared remarks, and I can be available for questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Marshall, Michael, and Nathan for those presentations. And now we'd like to turn it over to our ad hoc committee for their questions and comments.
Pat, you want to go first? I'll go second.
Okay, maybe we can go back and forth. And first, I want to say thanks especially to Marshall and Michael. Those were just really profound presentations. And I just want to point out too that this is a city council subcommittee. We typically on subcommittees get a few people who attend. The SCAP committee has been getting an incredible 50 to 80 people at each meeting. We're at 120 here for you guys. And it just shows that there's a real yearning for this information, and what you've presented is just not only profound, but it's not widely understood. And I'm just trying to think about how we're going to leverage your information and really get more broadly appreciated. Because I understand Marshall has to leave shortly, I wanted to ask whether there's been on the health impacts. I saw that there recently there had been studies preliminary out of UCLA and Stanford on the estimated impacts that we've had in recent years in the 2020 year, fatalities in those years resulting from wildfires, not the direct inflammation, but the impact on people that have compromised pulmonary systems and the like. And they're maybe 2 orders of magnitude greater than what we actually report as the fatalities each year. But what I haven't seen is anything on the projected longevity impacts and the cumulative effects. Are there starting to be studies on that?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. there are starting to be studies on that. One of the challenges has been in accurately understanding who's exposed to what. So I think there's been a lot of research more broadly on impacts of short-term and long-term exposure to other air pollutants or to particulates more broadly. I think for wildfire, one of the big questions is, can we use those estimates or do we need wildfire specific estimates? And I think the research is starting to suggest that wildfire smoke might be fundamentally different than some other particulates in a way that we really need to focus on the smoke in particular. So we have a couple projects underway on that. There's a lot of interesting questions on soil types. So there are toxins in soils that get aerosolized during some of these wildfires. Does that have a health impact? What happens when you get urban incursion of these wildfires and you incinerate and aerosolize all the nasty chemicals that are under our sink or have been sitting in our garage, right? We don't know yet. So you're right. There's evidence that wildfire smoke not only makes people sick, but leads to early mortality, unfortunately. Our estimates suggested that potentially 1,000 additional mortalities just in the Bay Area from, or actually population centers across California from the 2020 wildfires. But again, that's based on saying, okay, wildfire smoke is sort of like other pollutants that are better studied. And honestly, I don't know if that's the right approach. So we're in a position now to, I think, have a better answer to that question now that we have satellites and these other estimates of who's being exposed to what. There's not a published estimate that right now can answer your question.
And then this is really probably more for both of you. I think we probably can all recognize that we're well behind the curve in understanding and responding to the risks that have that exist today and have become more acute in recent years and have escalated. But all the discussions that I've seen to date have been, how do we catch up to the current risk level? And very little about whether anybody thinks this is as bad as it's going to get. So can you speak briefly about what we should expect on the horizon, as imprecise as those projections may be, and how far behind the curve are we in responding to the threats?
Well, the climate scientists that are seeking to explain the change in fire behavior that we've observed over the last decade to 10 to 20 years relative to the 20th century think there's a kind of a growing consensus that it has a lot to do with the fact that as the planet warms, the air can hold more water vapor. And so it gets, in effect, thirstier. It's like sucking the water out of plants off the ground. And that dries the fuels much more rapidly. And so you get this much more dried out fuel environment that's more combustible. And many folks think that, I mean, the expectation is that's going to continue, right? We're going to continue to see warming because we're not cutting emissions fast enough. And so we need to be prepared for that. And what that probably means is that fuel environments that we haven't seen burn in a historic period are going to become more flammable and potentially subject to, what wildland fire folks would call, crown replacing fires, right? Like where you could see, and so we've started to see that to some degree in Oregon and Washington to the west of the Cascades, where fires have burned in areas that people just didn't think could burn because they hadn't burned in a historic period. And of course, we've seen, quite catastrophic fires in the Santa Cruz Mountains. I think that sort of fire behavior is something that we need to be prepared to deal with. And certainly California and California fire suppression agencies are gearing up. But it also means that we need to be thinking about fuels management in a much more active way, because we're not going to be able to rely on wet fog and precipitation and sort of cool, wet summers to keep us safe in Northern California moving forward. And it also means that we need to be prepared, homes are fuel, and we need to be prepared for urban conflagrations and hardening homes in just the way that Nathan Rainey was just suggesting, so that we can really avoid outcomes where we see house-to-house fires. And that's adaptation to climate change, unfortunately. So the one thing I would say is, you know, in terms of forests and keeping forests intact, we need to really focus on keeping the big old trees when we can, and being willing to remove younger, smaller, thinner trees, because the big old trees are the ones that are the most fire resilient. They're the ones that are most likely to be able to survive fire when it inevitably occurs.
Thank you. Allison, all yours.
Great. Professor Burke, I know you have to leave soon, so I'm gonna start with you. So two things. One, thank you for at least pointing the way towards what people can do. You know, this topic, this version of this topic is as scary as all the rest. So thanks for at least having a photo of the filtration devices people should have. We only have one in our house. I think when I get off this call, I'm going to go order a few more. So really appreciate that, because that's, you know, the natural inclination of everyone when they get this information is to do something. So appreciate that. I wonder also if you could talk about temperature. So Mr. Ware was just talking about it in the context of fire, but I think there's also a lot of studies similar to the one that you did about smoke and test scores, and it's intertwined with temperature. We know a lot about that. Anything you want to add in terms of temperature and how this is related?
Thanks, Allison. It's a really important question. Absolutely. So there's sort of parallel sets of research. One studying the impacts of wildfire and air pollution exposure, and another studying the exposure of extreme heat. I think what we've seen, and this is actually a project we're literally working on in my group right now, is to better quantify the sort of overlapping exposure. Is it the case that we get those exposures more and more at the same time? And almost surely it is. And that's because extreme heat is going up. Extreme heat is related to, as Michael just mentioned, the incidence of these damaging extreme wildfires, right? That generate the smoke. So almost surely we're getting a confluence of these two exposures. That is a real problem. And it's a real problem specifically if you do not have air conditioning, and you see county health departments really struggling with what to tell people to do if you have both really hot temperatures and a lot of smoke outside, right? If you don't have AC, you're supposed to open your windows and let air flow through your house, right? That's the last thing you want to do with smoke in the air. So different county health departments have taken different stances, and we've been looking through their directives on this. Right now, they're prefacing heat. They're telling you to keep your windows open when it gets really hot, even if there is smoke outside. Is that the right thing to do? Maybe, but it's a real problem, right? So we need to think of ways to sort of jointly solve these exposures, as you mentioned. And I think right now we don't have a great sense of what to tell people to do, other than like try to stay cool and not breathe dirty air, right? So like cooling centers that are also clean air centers, right? That's a community level thing that I think we need a lot more of. So you're right that we need to be thinking about these exposures together.
Yeah, one of the things I wrote down is, you know, what to think about in terms of actions the city can and should take. So our public buildings, right? One of the problems we've had during COVID is our cooling center. Like, do you want to shove a lot of people in the cooling center? You know, okay, that's not a great idea either.
Right.
So
COVID adds a whole nother layer. Right.
I know it's a whole, everything is harder with COVID. So thinking about our public buildings going forward, I've been talking about this for years, that we have to view air conditioning as an adaptation in our public spaces. Yeah. So that's one. Certainly, you know, we've talked a little bit about homes today. So Marshall, we're going to let you go. You know, I know you got a hard stop. So thank you so much. And I'll be buying a few more air purifiers.
Great.
Can I just make one additional comment about smoke and heat? And that's that I think that one of the really important solutions may be building electrification.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here. That's
because building having people think heat pump and they're like, well, what does that do for extreme heat? But the reality is heat pumps can run in reverse, or many can, and you can ensure that at very little incremental cost. And that allows for air conditioning, and it allows for high quality filtration of buildings, and it solves for the greenhouse gas emissions problem over which local governments do have a lot of control, right? Building codes. And so I think there's this is something to think about, the adaptation benefits of that mitigation measure tend not to be incorporated in when we think about how to roll out programs. And the other thing to think about is, if we're going to spend money electrifying buildings, maybe we should be electrifying the buildings where vulnerable people live, right? Thinking about vulnerable populations, like where are there seniors? Maybe if there's a program to facilitate building electrification, maybe we should be targeting seniors. Maybe we should be targeting schools, because there's lots of kids in schools. And so we can add AC or add heat pumps in a commercial sense to really facilitate both protection from heat, protection from smoke, and the mitigation benefit. And I think thinking about that cohesively as a whole is really important to justifying a very high cost.
Yeah, we are definitely talking about co-benefits. And so thanks for linking the mitigation with the adaptation part. Really appreciate that. So Mr. Ware, I'm sorry, I don't know. Are you also professor? It wasn't entirely
I'm not.
clear. Okay. Right. Okay. Just trying to recognize everyone's appropriate titles here. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, a lot of what you spoke about was state regulations and federal changes, things like that. What, if anything, would you recommend to municipalities in terms of changing laws, the ways we think about reciprocity with the land? Any tips for us to bring it down to a level that we can work on here?
Well, I think one question I would have is, for municipalities and in terms of laws and or really ordinances is thinking about working with your fire departments to evaluate whether they want to adopt, there are codes that are used in Ventura County and LA County that create a much more straightforward path to enforcement of defensible space and especially zone 1 and zone 0 defensible space maintenance, and basically facilitate creation of that space if the homeowner doesn't do it, and then billing the homeowner on their tax bill. And the question to be thinking about is whether what the right approach is, the mix of carrots and sticks, and it's got to be carrots too, right? Funding to help people afford taking out a dangerous eucalyptus tree or a dying Monterey pine, that's a fire hazard that can be really expensive, and maybe people on fixed income can't afford that. But coming up with a mix of carrots and sticks to really ramp up that program and make it less of a kind of firefighter drives by, says hello, tries to be nice, but everyone ignores the recommendations if they don't like them. And moving toward a situation where this is really a top priority, because we just can't afford to lose houses. It's hard enough to build new product in California. And the Palo Alto community in the last 2 to 3 decades has just gone through, it's such a difficult place for people to afford to live now. And I think we really need to preserve the housing stock we have and avoid an urban conflagration, which is unfortunately, more and more possible because of the changing climate and changing fire weather. So that'd be the way, I think in terms of laws and ordinances. And then I guess the other piece of it would be, to the degree that City of Palo Alto participates and has a voice in the local AQMD, facilitating consideration of prescribed fire on the Hill and supporting efforts to implement better fuels management policies in the open space that we all benefit from. And that also there's a funding component to that, a recognition, that I'd point to the work in Marin to develop a Marin-wide fire protection initiative, and via initiative. And I think that sort of approach could be very constructive in the South Bay, and would create the resources that we need to invest in the infrastructure.
That's super helpful. Thank you for the specificity. Appreciate that, Mr. Wera. And my final question, Mr. Rainey, is for you. One of the things Mr. Wera's presentation showed, and I thought this might be where he was going, was the destruction and the death that we saw in the Oakland and in Paradise, partially related to the lack of our ability to evacuate. So any thoughts from Office of Emergency Services about how we should be thinking differently in the city about how we evacuate in the event there is an urban conflagration?
Well, in terms of evacuating during an urban conflagration, now I'll say that's not one of the things that we spend a lot of time planning for currently.
I'm not sure if that makes me feel better or worse.
Well, I mean, if you think about what currently, we plan for really response to current threats, and so an urban conflagration isn't really a current threat yet. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we evacuate our Foothills residents, understanding that Foothills, the same roads that our Foothills residents evacuate from, are the same ones that Los Altos Hills residents and Los Altos and others in the Foothills use. And so we prioritize our fuel reduction activities to support those evacuation routes of Pageville Road, Los Francos Road, as well as Skyline, and that's done in a much more broader regional context, not only for evacuation, but also for routes that our resource providers or our responders can get up into those areas. So there are limited budgets that we have to maintain these routes, but we do prioritize them so that we have safe routes for people to move, move either up the hill or down the hill based on where the fire is. When we look at the urban fires, there are really, if we and we look at this in terms of flood, if we have a flood in the town, or
we'll get to that next, and sea level rise.
If there's an earthquake, there are enough surface streets in Palo Alto for people to move out of immediate areas of danger. But when we start talking about evacuating, maybe from if there's need to evacuate broad portions of the city, either north or south on the peninsula, there are limited routes. And so what we need to be working with, and it's not just become a Palo Alto problem, it becomes a problem for all of the communities along the Bay, to help to talk about how do we manage traffic if we're evacuating our low-lying portions of the cities, either north or south. And so that requires more study, more work.
I just think a tabletop exercise might be in order. The question that the mayor asked earlier about, like, are we catching up to the problem we have today, or are we thinking about how much worse the problem could be in the future? So maybe we'll put that on the list. And I'll turn back to Brad, who's managing our time and next steps here. Thank you all for coming this morning.
Thank you. Managing time, and I managed to order my Purple Air monitor while we were in process. So thanks for the tip. I do see that we have, I think, 4 of our working group members here with us this morning. So wanted to give a chance if any of them would like to ask some questions as well on this topic. So go ahead and raise your hand, or Lincoln, I see you there. Lincoln, then Diane.
Sure. I'm really curious. I am relatively new to California and getting used to worrying about wildfires. The fire drought and flood map that you showed absolutely blew me away. I was thinking about how many millions of square miles that is, how many millions of acres. Is there anybody worldwide that is getting this right, or getting it righter than others? I mean, are there any models that we can look to from a legislative standpoint, or from a forest management standpoint, that we can we can say, okay, we want to learn from them, or is the whole world basically, closing their eyes and walking forward together on this?
I'd say that there are smaller scale success stories, Lincoln, but there aren't really, there's nothing I would point to at the scale of California. Certainly there is a ton to learn from Australia, where, this issue has been on the radar for a long time, and because of the bushfire problems there, and they, and there are a bunch of, there are significant aspects of the Australian approach that I think could be really opportunities for learning. And I would commend you to look at, there was a Royal Commission report that was produced after the, really terrible bushfire season of, I think it was the 2020 season. And that's just chock full of ideas and learnings that are applicable to another place in a Mediterranean climate. But I think in terms, the other places I would point to actually are, what's going on in the Klamath region, I think is very interesting in Northern California, where tribes and forest managers are really trying to coordinate with the federal government as well, to create greater safety and resilience for the communities that exist there, that are, much more fire threatened than Palo Alto, but also where folks, the tribes are re-engaging and being empowered to re-engage as land stewards, in collaboration with lots of people that do prescribed fire and do, and I think there's an effort on private lands in the Bay Area through what's called a prescribed to burn association to do this. CAL FIRE wants to do more of the fuels management, but it's also, frankly, like resource strapped because they're so busy fighting fire. Part of the challenge here is that the fire suppression agencies they're running flat out. They are working so hard, and we're lucky that they are. I mean, I don't want them working any less hard than they can sustainably on keeping us all safe, but it leaves them in the off season when you might want them to be out in the field, setting good fire, right? Or running fuels management projects, needing to take rest, needing to take vacations that they didn't take because they were working triple overtime during the fire season that, is months longer than it used to be. So I think there's a capacity issue that's really important. And we need to start working, and the state is doing this. I mean, California is investing significantly more money on fuels management than the federal government is for the entire rest of the country. So we're heading in the right direction. But I think everyone needs to have an oar in the water, local governments, as well as the state, as well as the feds.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I mean, first of all, the indigenous knowledge that, so much of sustainability is ultimately about swinging back around to the knowledge of the people who've lived here forever, which I don't think gets enough notice. But also, I'll raise my hand to volunteer to go to Australia for an extensive due diligence trip. Be happy to do that. So thank you very much. I'm going to put that report in the chat so everybody can grab it.
Thanks, Lincoln. And Diane?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. I really appreciate the presentations this morning, and especially the attention to health impacts from smoke from wildfires. And along those lines, I was wondering if there was any effort underway to contact vulnerable segments of the population in Palo Alto to let people know about the risks during wildfire season and kind of the smoke episodes. I think that a lot of people might be severely impacted and just not know about the risks. And especially I think about asthmatic kids and using the schools to contact parents about different actions they can take to protect asthmatic kids. But people can suffer from asthma at any age, and there are other medical conditions that make people vulnerable. The Air District does have a program to distribute air filters to seniors and other medically vulnerable folks. I'm not sure if that has reached Palo Alto or not, but I think it'd be wonderful to either collaborate with the Air District or form a program within Palo Alto to get air filters to people in need, and also to educate those folks that they need to take steps to seal their home, close windows during these events. And to Michael Wara's point about electrification being an important tool to improve air quality, I think that's spot on. And yeah, obviously the city can't give away free heat pump air conditioners to everyone, but I do know that the Air District is considering expanding their program to offer air filters to disadvantaged communities. They will consider next year to offer portable heat pump units that offer heating and cooling, because a lot of the most vulnerable folks within our communities don't have AC. And so they're stuck in that conundrum during wood smoke events when there's high heat. Do they open their windows or not? And there's no good answer for them. So I would really encourage the city to partner with the Air District, look at those portable heat pump options, as well as air filters, and to do direct outreach either through medical providers or the schools or both to try to reach those vulnerable folks within the community. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane. I just want to jump in and say that our Chief Communication Officer is one of the many people listening today. And while her plate is already quite full, I'm sure there's something we can do in this area.
Okay, thanks. Really good discussion. It's 10:17. Let's take a 5-minute break and we'll resume with the sea level rise discussion at 10:22. So 10:22 sharp. Thanks, everyone.
Michael,
Yeah.
this is Pat. Hi. Just while we got you on the on a break, there's so many questions that we would have as follow-up. One I didn't get a chance to ask is, last year, well, really last 2 years, and now in the next state budget, we've got an historic increase in our funding that toward wildfire protection and response that you alluded to. But what and how those funds will be used is still not at least clear to a lot of us. You may be more intimate with it, but how would you appraise even that funding level versus the actual need and the uses of those funds and how well they're aligning with where we need to be spending them?
Well, my short answer is it's not enough money, but there's never going to be enough money, right? I mean, that's just like the reality. Even when money is falling out of the sky, like it has been for the last 2 years, or growing on trees or something. But where there are significant deficits are in terms of prescribed fire. In terms of there's a lot of money for fuels management, but most of it is going for mechanical thinning, kind of mastication, those kinds of things and sort of focused kind of fuel break type things that are effective, can be effective in low intensity fires, can be effective for creating, safe evacuation routes, but are not landscape level treatment. And we need to be thinking at landscape level at this point. That's a key take home from like the fire behavior this season and last season, is it's just not adequate anymore to imagine that we can sort of strategically place a fuel break that's a couple 100 feet wide and hope that it's going to stop the kinds of fire behavior we're observing. So the other pieces of the puzzle that I think are still maybe in development, I'll say, like I'm thinking optimistically, one is workforce training. There are not enough people who are qualified. And there are two aspects that CAL FIRE is working on. One is this state certified burn boss program, where we're training up sort of state certified experts on prescribed fire. That isn't moving fast enough. It's just not enough of a priority, I think. And the other piece of this is like all the other people that would support those people would be sort of the top of the pyramid, right? And you need all the people underneath to support them, and workforce training for prescribed fire is an urgent need. And then the last piece is we need to figure out what to do about older homes. It's really clear from the data from Santa Rosa and from Paradise that if you're living in a home that was built, after the year 2000, certainly after 2009, if it's built to the Chapter 7A Wildland Urban Interface Code, that you've got like twice the chance of surviving in that structure of surviving. But there's, most homes are old, and we need to think about how to harden homes. There's just $25 million that was allocated last year, and then I think 16 million in the proposed January budget in addition, to think about a home hardening program. And, there's hundreds of thousands of homes in the Wildland Urban Interface, on the Hill in Palo Alto, or elsewhere, that we need to figure out how to cost effectively improve. And that might be partnered with energy efficiency retrofits. A lot of the things that are going to make a home more resistant to ignition also probably will make it more energy efficient. But some of them won't. Some of them are just like stupid, easy stuff that everyone should do, like attic vents. And so how, and the thing is, there's enormous community benefit to making that investment, because a lot of the evidence from those fires suggests that one fire-prone home goes up and it is showering embers onto homes that might not otherwise ignite, or it's got a 16-foot setback to a home that otherwise might not ignite. So radiant heat from the burning home just overwhelms the defenses of an otherwise, pretty hardened structure. And so there's kind of like, it's a lot like vaccination, right? It's herd immunity. And we need to generate herd immunity in communities that are exposed to fire risk. And we're not doing enough as a state yet, but I'm hopeful we will. CAL FIRE is working on this. It's just, again, it gets to this issue of like, I have long been a proponent that we need an agency that's focused on this risk reduction as opposed to firefighting, that we should separate those roles, because the firefighting problem is so hard. And the idea that like the same people are going to do both jobs is asking a lot of people.
Yep. Well, thanks. And this, I'm really appreciate your depth of understanding on that. And I have plenty of other questions, but I see we're coming back from our break.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, let's take a walk sometime, Pat. I'd love to do that and talk
Sounds
more.
good. We'll bring in Lincoln, who he's the university new chief sustainability officer, basically. So,
yeah.
Okay, well, we're back. For those who were away, good discussion during the break. I'm going to turn to Christine, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Brad. So we are now going to switch to an update about the city's sea level rise planning efforts and the recently completed sea level rise vulnerability assessment. As a reminder, climate adaptation and sea level rise is one of the chapters of our Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. So first, we'll hear from Jeremy Lowe of the San Francisco Estuary Institute. He'll give an overview of what to anticipate for sea level rise in the Bay Area, and then we'll get an update from Julie Weiss about Palo Alto's sea level rise plan development progress. Jeremy is a coastal geomorphologist who leads the San Francisco Estuary Institute's initiatives related to rising ocean levels due to climate change. Jeremy has 30 years of experience in tidal wetland restoration and sea level rise adaptation planning on the Pacific coast and in Europe. His career includes designing sea defenses to reduce flooding in Venice. Italy innovator and developed nature-based climate change adaptation strategies for San Francisco Bay and the Lower Columbia. And born in Britain, Jeremy previously worked at the universities of Cambridge and Newcastle in England. And Julie is the interim Public Works Watershed Protection Program Manager. She has worked for more than 25 years on watershed-related policy and public education projects, such as plastic and pesticide pollution prevention, watershed outreach and school programs, and is the lead for developing the city's sea level rise adaptation plan. So before we begin with Jeremy and Julie's presentations, we wanted to get a sense of who's participating in today's sea level rise discussions and your main areas of interest. So I'm going to launch a poll. If you can please tell us about who you are so we have an idea of who's participating. So let that run for a minute. So we have a lot of residents on today. Thank you for joining us. Okay, I'm going to end this poll and get to the next one. Thank you for responding. It looks like the second poll is not working. So why don't we go to, oh, there it is. So we'd like to hear, the next poll is up, and we'd like to hear what your interests in sea level rise protection are. Protecting your home and community, habitat protection, or just general interest. So while that poll is up, we can run that while Jeremy gets started.
Great, thanks, Christine. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully people can see that. Okay, well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Vice Mayor Burt, Councilmember Cormack, and working group members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Jeremy Lowe with the San Francisco Estuary Institute, SFEI. I'm a coastal scientist with 35 years experience in wetland restoration and sea level rise adaptation, 20 years of those in the Bay. I'm going to start with an overview of sea level rise projections, and then next I'll talk about how the landscape of Palo Alto interacts with flooding and how this may change with sea level rise. Then I'll discuss some of the measures that in combination can manage the risk of flooding and provide ecological benefits. I'll then pass to Julie. Sorry, I keep getting the poll results coming up in front of me. I'll then pass to Julie to talk about the specific vulnerabilities of Palo Alto. So this diagram shows the main drivers of sea level rise. The dark blue in the middle of the diagram is the ocean. As the atmosphere warms, heat is transferred to the oceans, and as the water heats up, it expands. This thermal expansion is a long-term process that will lead to a gradual increase in sea level. The warming of the atmosphere also leads to the melting of ice on land, the glaciers of Alaska and Greenland, and the ice sheets of Antarctica. This loss of ice from the land introduces more water into the oceans and raises water levels. Such a process may be more rapid and less predictable as ice sheets become more unstable as they carve and melt. But it's not just the sea level rising. The land adjacent to the bay is also moving relative to the water. There's been subsidence following the diking and draining of historical marshes. In the past, there's been subsidence from groundwater extraction, and there is movement due to the shifting of tectonic plates. All add up to give us the relative sea level that we see at the shoreline and that we need to adapt to. So this graphic illustrates the past measurement of sea level at the Golden Gate and projections of how sea level is likely to rise in the future. The black line on the left is the historical record of monthly sea level, which has a spiky appearance due to storm surges and periodic variations in ocean water levels due to phenomena such as El Niños. And you can also see a general trend in the black line due to sea level rise, which has been about 8 inches since 1850. The orange and green lines, the right, are illustrative projections of sea level rise in the future based on numerical models. They are smooth as they show projected mean sea level and not the relatively short variations of storms and El Niños. The lines gradually increase in steepness as the sea level is projected to rise faster and faster. The two different lines reflect different emission scenarios. The orange line is a future of higher emissions, a greater rate of heating of the atmosphere, and a faster rate of sea level rise. The green line is a future with lower emissions, a lower rate of heating, and a slower rate of sea level rise. However, even though they are different emission rates, they both show increasing sea levels this century. Before 2050, they are indistinguishable due to the buildup of heat already in the atmosphere and oceans. And even with a reduction of emissions to mitigate climate change, we still have to adapt to the sea level rise that's already baked into the oceans. The interaction between the atmosphere, oceans, ice sheets, and land is complex. However, the understanding of these processes is increasing. As more data is collected and models improve, projections are updated. To help communities keep abreast of this evolving science, the state has provided information and guidance on sea level rise, updated every 5 years or so. And the latest guidance was published in 2018 and provides advice on scenario selection using a risk-based approach and planning approaches for critical assets, natural habitats, and public access. And this is a great resource that can be downloaded from the Ocean Protection Council website, www.opc.gov. The projections used in the vulnerability assessment follow this guidance and take into account the types of assets at risk. The types of assets in Palo Alto warrant the use of projections with a 1 in 200 chance of occurring, which would be about 24 inches by 2050 and 66 to 84 inches by 2100. Two values are given for 2100, reflecting high and low emission scenarios. And there is enough heat baked into the global system that at least 6 foot of sea level rise is inevitable over the next few centuries. So it's not going to stop at 2100. But it's not just the rising seas that lead to flooding. The landscape and how it has been modified change the risk of flooding. These oblique drawings characterize the South Bay in the past and how man has modified it. The lower picture shows the past, with water flowing from the hills on the left in channels across grasslands and oak savanna of the alluvial fans towards the bay on the right. As the water got closer to the bay, the land slopes flattened and the water in the channels spread out across the floodplains and fans, creating a band of gently sloping wet meadows. Right next to the bay, these gently sloping wet meadows gave way to the flat expanses of tidal marshes that were regularly flooded by salt water twice a day. The upper picture shows the same area today. Much of the wet meadow and grasslands have been built upon, shown in gray. They are now cities like Palo Alto. Many of the natural channels were straightened and much of the area was drained with channels and pumps. In addition, land subsidence and inadequate drainage to the bay exacerbated flooding in lower lying areas. The lowest areas, the tidal marshes, are challenging to build in. Urban development, roads, and so on kept out of them as much as possible. And instead, they were diked off to become flood-controlled basins and ponds for the production of salt. These low-lying areas are known as the diked baylands and form a band between the urban areas and the bay. And this is an example of a diked bayland in the East Bay. These diked baylands, being former marshes, won't flood on normal tides unless protected by levees or filled. Here we see the levee on a calm day at low tide. And this is the same levee at high tide during a storm with waves generated within the bay. These dike baylands can also flood from stormwater conveyed in channels. This is a photo of downtown Martinez flooded by Alhambra Creek. If the bay water levels are high, water cannot flow easily to the bay and backs up along the channels, eventually overtopping its banks and flooding adjacent areas. This aerial view of Palo Alto shows the clear distinction between today's urban areas and the marshes, flood basins, and ponds, the diked baylands. There is a gentle slope across the alluvial fan to Highway 101 and then down to the flat ponds. Stormwater continues to flow downhill from the hills as it always has, but rather than allow it to form wet meadows, we now pump it into channels, collect it in flood basins, and release it to the bay at low tide. To manage flooding, we need to identify the different sources of flooding. For Palo Alto, there are 4 potential sources: from the bay, from the sky as rainfall, from inland channels, and from below as groundwater. Today, water levels in the bay result from a combination of mean sea level, tides, El Niños, and storm surges. The highest tides are relatively predictable, called king tides, and are about a foot above the daily tides. El Niños result in regional increases of a foot or so for several months. Storm surges are in the 2 to 3 feet range due to low pressure that elevates the water. Winds also associated with storms generate waves that can make flooding worse. The existing levees and berms around the bay keep the regular tides and storms out and are rarely overtopped. With sea level rise, the water levels in the bay will increase and the overtopping of existing levees will be more likely. Raising the levee will provide greater protection. Rainwater will flow and pond as it makes its way to channels, leading to flooding. Drainage ditches, detention basins, and storm drains collect and convey stormwater to channels and ultimately to the bay. In very low-lying areas close to the bay, water will collect behind the levees, create seasonal wetlands, and be pumped into the channels. The effect of rising bay levels and increasing ponding can be met with more detention space and increased pumping. Several channels that pass through Palo Alto bring water from inland to the bay and also convey stormwater. If the flow exceeds the channel's capacity, water could overflow onto the adjacent floodplain. In Palo Alto, natural channels have been straightened and separated from their natural floodplain, which means that banks need to be higher to contain the flows. If the bay water levels are high when channels flows are high, then water in the channels backs up and can overtop its banks. The Palo Alto flood control basin is purpose-built to collect stormwater from these channels when the bay water levels are high and release it under gravity at low tide. With rising sea levels, gravity drainage may be more limited. The potential for backing up and flooding will increase as the sea level rises. Widening the floodplain and raising the channel levees will increase the capacity of the channels, as has been done along San Francisco Creek. Lastly, and mostly unseen, groundwater is close to the surface in many low-lying areas. The subsurface consists of a complex layering of relatively impermeable clays interlaced with thin, more permeable aquifers. The lower aquifer zone is about 150 feet or more below the ground surface and is fairly continuous and connected. It's been extensively studied and managed as it is where fresh water is being pumped. Above that is the upper aquifer zone. In the Palo Alto area, close to the bay, this shallow groundwater will be maybe less than 5 feet below the surface and is closest to the surface when it's closest to the bay. This upper aquifer zone is the subject of ongoing research as there is increasing interest in how it may be affected by sea level rise. Any groundwater rise is likely to be slower than the sea level rise and be spatially varied. It may impact underground utilities and structures if they corrode and become buoyant. In very low-lying areas, it could lead to surface flooding. Cut-off walls can reduce groundwater intrusion, and local water table elevations can be limited by pumping. Raising finished floor elevations and flood-proofing buildings can reduce the impacts of both groundwater and surface water flooding. Over the next 20 years, we can expect to see upgrades to levees to accommodate higher bay levels. There are also plans to restore many of the salt ponds to tidal marsh through the South Bay Salt Ponds Restoration Project. Levees and marshes together can reduce flood risk by preventing inundation and reducing wave action. Some levees may have longer and flatter slopes, called horizontal levees, to accommodate both flood protection and maintain marsh habitat. These still protect from higher water levels, but they also provide more upland habitat adjacent to marshes, which is missing from many parts of the bay. And a prototype of a horizontal levee has been constructed at Oraloma in Hayward, and that's been vegetated with native upland species. In concert with the salt pond restorations, the city, the Corps of Engineers, Valley Water, and the Coastal Conservancy are studying a new levee from San Francisco Creek to Shoreline Park to accommodate at least 50 years of sea level rise. This is called the Safer Shoreline 2 levee. Such a study will consider several levee alignments. The levee provides protection, but it needs to provide a continuous line of protection. It needs to connect to levees that follow the creeks inland to prevent water flooding behind them. So to protect Palo Alto from flooding, it is necessary to consider the larger shoreline levee and the marsh restoration projects, together with inland channel improvements to share the management of flooding. So how could these projects work in concert to provide protection and restore habitats, and importantly, How do they play out over time? Here is a hypothetical timeline of activities or adaptation pathway for a typical stretch of the bay. This horizontal scale is the sea level rise, rising from 0 feet on the left to 5 feet on the right. I've also marked in gray the existing levees and marshes to indicate they are effective now. Palo Alto does not flood from the bay often, but we know the levees need upgrading. They were not designed with sea level rise. So I have put a dotted line at 1 foot to indicate that we are close to a threshold and need to upgrade the protection. The response may be to raise the levees and perhaps the marsh, but we have to decide soon as levees take a long time to plan and construct. The orange bar indicates the lead time of design and permitting. The blue triangle shows the decision point or trigger. I put a second dotted line at 3 feet to indicate that more extreme measures may be needed later in the century. As you can see, the horizontal axis continues past that dotted line as sea level will continue to rise well into the future, and we will need to continue to adapt. In the latter part of the century, towards the end of the design life of the levee and before flooding becomes an issue, we would expect to see changes in sea level and groundwater, changes in the assets that need to be protected, and the growth of the restored marshes to provide more protection. With these new conditions, there needs to be an evaluation of how the levee is performing, how the management of flooding is shared, and what changes need to be made to maintain the level of flood protection. Before we can plan such an adaptation pathway for Palo Alto, we need to understand the risks and rising sea levels. And now Julie's going to discuss the vulnerability assessment, which will inform efforts to develop Palo Alto's sea level rise adaptation plan, and which will provide ultimately adaptation pathways. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Julie.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I'll share my screen. Okay. Christine, can you confirm that you are seeing my screen properly?
Yes, it looks great.
Great. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, Julie Weiss, City of Palo Alto. I'm our Acting Watershed Protection Program Manager. And today I'm going to provide an update on Palo Alto's sea level rise adaptation planning efforts, focusing on the vulnerability assessment that is currently in the peer review process. I'm going to also touch on sea level rise protection efforts that are already underway, and share a high altitude view of what the sea level rise plan may include. So the sea level rise vulnerability assessment will inform the development of the sea level rise adaptation plan that we're going to be working on this year with staff in the community. This work was directed by council, and it will serve as the sea level rise chapter of the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. We have two goals for this effort. One is to preserve and expand habitat, and the second is to protect and adapt the community. But before we can develop a plan, we need to know what we need to protect ourselves from. We need to understand the hazards we face from sea level rise, by when we need to take action so that we're ready in time and so that we can prioritize our resources. And this is the purpose of the vulnerability assessment. We have moved through several steps of the assessment before we move into the plan development phase in this next year ahead. The assessment will look at how our community will be exposed to 12 to 84 inches of sea level rise during daily conditions of daily high tides, and then the most extreme worst case scenario of 100-year storm tide, and also evaluates conditions of our shallow groundwater to help us plan for that. Our assessment helps us answer at which increment of sea level rise will our assets be exposed, how sensitive and how adaptable are they, and what are the risks if we don't protect them? And again, when is action needed to prevent damage? While several conditions, meaning several increments of sea level rise, are analyzed, the report discussion focuses on 36 inches of sea level rise because that's a turning point for us if no additional action is taken beyond what we've already completed. Based on state guidance, we would anticipate seeing this level of sea level rise near the end of the century, somewhere between 50 to 80 years, depending on how we globally address greenhouse gas emissions in the years ahead. So Palo Alto's vulnerability assessment is a 200-page technical document that examines how 5 asset categories could be exposed to the sea level rise and groundwater conditions we've talked about. So that we are consistent with planning efforts around the Bay Area, we use the best available science and modeling efforts used by other regional planning projects. The inundation and groundwater work was conducted by experts in the field in consultation with the San Francisco Estuary Institute, which is where Jeremy works, and also factors in a tremendous amount of input from our city staff who have enormous expertise in the asset categories that we're trying to protect. In addition, because Palo Alto is just one of 2 Bay Area cities so far to consider groundwater impacts from sea level rise, we did have the groundwater portion of the report peer reviewed by Dr. Christina Hill of UC Berkeley. She is a pioneer and a leader in understanding this emerging hazard, and we are currently evaluating her input. So I'm going to walk us through the results of the vulnerability assessment, but I want to remind us first that we are not starting from scratch on our sea level rise protection efforts. This project, for example, the San Francisco Creek Downstream project widened the creek channel and built new levees. And this project provides protection from a 100-year creek flood and 3 feet of sea level rise. Another key effort that Jeremy touched on is the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline 2 study, which it looks at improvements we need for the levee system surrounding Palo Alto. Although tidal flooding has not been a current problem in Palo Alto, portions of South Palo Alto are in the FEMA floodplain and are subject to insurance requirements because Palo Alto's older levee system does not meet FEMA accreditation standards. So while the current levee system will, with 36 inches of sea level rise, the current levee system won't be able to protect us for those high tides. And so that is the purpose of the Shoreline 2 study. Currently, that project team is looking at hydrology models. They are meeting with permitting agencies, and they hope to have the report for suggested levee alignments in fall of 2024. In addition, this image here, the Palo Alto Tide Gate, Palo Alto is working with our flood protection agency, Valley Water, to reconstruct this tide gate. The tide gate regulates water between the bay and the Palo Alto flood basin, which holds downstream water levels from Matadero, Adobe, and Barron Creeks during large storms. The new tide gate would continue to provide protection against flooding due to tidal flows, accommodating for sea level rise, and continue to provide the necessary storage capacity for creek flows during those large storm events. In addition, Palo Alto is conducting a pilot horizontal levee project, sometimes referred to as living levees. This pilot project would be the first in the Bay Area to be hydrologically connected to the bay, and it could inform how we add more habitat, not just to Palo Alto's levee alignments, but levee systems throughout the Bay Area. We have also already begun physical adaptation efforts. This is an image of our power distribution equipment at the wastewater treatment facility. We are already starting to raise waterproof equipment in some of our city facilities like the wastewater treatment plant. And because we also know that public education is going to be a huge part of our sea level rise planning, we have started providing webinars about sea level rise during king tides. And this year we developed sea level rise curriculum for K through 5th grades students that can be used throughout our water quality control plant service area. So while all these projects are great and they are going to make a difference, we still need to have an integrated plan so all of our subsequent Additional adaptation actions are coordinated and brought online at the right time. So we need to have that integrated plan. And we already talked about the goals of that plan, which are to preserve and expand habitat and protect our community. When we talk about sea level rise planning in the Bay Area, you hear about 3 general strategies that we can take. We can protect our community. That usually means by keeping water out through levees and tide gates. We can adapt to the existing infrastructure that we can't move. It's already there, so we need to waterproof it or figure out how to raise it to keep water out. And we also need to talk about retreat considerations near the end of the century for assets that are outside of the levees, things like perhaps our Baylands Interpretive Center or the sailing station. We need to make habitat considerations. So these are the strategies that we consider when we start working on the adaptation plan. And I know that trying to visualize a plan can be a pretty murky exercise to go through. So this is a little snippet of what a plan might look like. So as Jeremy discussed, we would work with the community and our staff to generate a number of ideas, actions that we can take to protect our community. But you need more than just a list of actions. You need to sequence them together in a logical way and time them properly. And that is the adaptation pathway concept that Jeremy was talking about. So our plan would also be timed so that we are looking at the actual level of sea level rise where we're at so that we can start planning in time. And that is the high level view of that plan there. So what is in the actual vulnerability assessment that will be, which will inform that plan? So this is the plan itself. And when you open it up, you will see that we have taken extra care to provide a succinct executive summary for those of you who don't want to read a 200-page technical document. We talk about the science that was used to develop the plan. We discuss how mapping was made for both sea level rise and groundwater conditions. And then we start digging deep into the vulnerabilities of those 5 asset categories. And then for those of you who want to do a really deep dive on understanding all of this, you could look at the very specific shallow groundwater assessment that was conducted. That's the one that's in peer review. That information is woven all throughout the report, but for those of you who want to go deep, you can look at those 2 attachments there. So under the identified vulnerability section, you would see for each of those categories 2 tables. One looks like this. There'd also be a lot of narrative explaining what's going to happen, but there would be 2 tables, one that looks like this, that helps us understand the level of sea level rise at which a certain asset would be exposed. So we talked about that 36-inch level. Let's just use that as an example. So at 36 inches of sea level rise, we would expect to see high tide conditions impact the Baylands Interpretive Center. And it would also be subject to storm tide conditions. And it's already subject to those 100-year storm tide conditions right now. And so there are many more assets just within this category, but this just gives you a picture of what this might look like. And then for each of those categories, you would also see information about what to expect for our changing groundwater conditions. So again, let's look at that 36-inch level of sea level rise. We would anticipate at that point that Mitchell Park Library would really need to start monitoring high shallow groundwater, and also leading up to that 36-inch level of sea level rise. And if no action was to be taken, we would begin to see emergent groundwater, that shallow groundwater that emerges to the surface, could start appearing on portions of Mitchell Park property. So this gives you an idea of the type of detail that is in that report. So I've been showing you bullet points and tables, but I want to help you see an actual picture of what all this could mean. So this is current conditions with a high tide, which don't pose a threat to our community. We usually just see a small amount of overtopping during those king tide seasons in January and December, which we can deal with by putting sandbags out around the levee at the Interpretive Center. However, if we were to take no action beyond the efforts we've already accomplished, we would expect to see a significant tipping point at 36 inches of sea level rise. And this is what 36 inches of sea level rise would look like during daily high tide conditions. And that approximates today's 25-year storm tide condition. So these daily high tide changes would expose our transportation system to bay water along 30 miles of streets and some of our evacuation routes. We would see impacts to our airport. We would not see exposure to Caltrain, but we would also begin to see exposure to residential parcels. We would start seeing changes to our marsh habitat because there would be more and more inundation in that area. And we would see situations where our parks and our urban forest, which is represented by these green dots, would be contending with more daily inundation, and the same for our above and below ground utilities, which are represented by these brown dots. So in the assessment, we get into a lot of detail, in very specific detail, about the kinds of exposure that we would see. So these conditions would be even more exacerbated in that ultimate worst case scenario of 100-year storm tide. So we would see increased exposure to those assets that we just looked at. So in addition to needing to plan for exposure to sea level rise inundation, we need to be mindful about the water beneath our feet. This is our current groundwater conditions. On this slide, the darker the color, the closer the groundwater is to the surface, and the purple is that emergent groundwater. To understand how groundwater conditions may change in the years ahead, existing well data and soil reports from construction projects in Palo Alto was used to calculate the depth to groundwater during wet weather conditions. And then maps were made to reflect changes equivalent to that 36 inches and other increments of sea level rise. And we can see that one of our main takeaways from the vulnerability assessment is that we can anticipate that our groundwater will indeed move closer to the surface and further inland. And this could create conditions that we need to plan for those asset categories, such as below ground utilities and the roots of our urban forests and our building foundations. These conditions could mobilize any contaminants that haven't been fully remediated from sites that we currently have, and they could exacerbate existing liquefaction in areas near the shoreline that are already vulnerable. And these conditions can't be managed by above ground protections such as levees. So I know that looking at these maps, it's dramatic and it's unsettling. However, this information is also hugely empowering. It is the information that will help us develop a plan that will get us the right level of protection at the right place and the right time. And it will help provide a roadmap that we can build upon in the decades ahead for our future community leaders as they continue to work through these challenges. And the good news is that there are things that we can do to address these hazards, and we have time. We don't have time to waste, but we have time to put together a plan to help us address these concerns. And we've already started brainstorming a pretty large list of potential actions we could take that we are going to be bringing to our staff and bringing to our community. And I wanted to give you just a few ideas of what we could do. Remember, we were talking about those protect, adapt, retreat strategies. So a protect strategy, clearly we need to move forward with those levee and tide gate improvements. We also really need to think about what we're going to do about those changing groundwater conditions, increasing monitoring and expanding groundwater waterproofing. We need to really think about how we're going to protect our habitat, and then again have that integrated plan so we're all singing off the same sheet of music for our planning efforts. For adaptation, we could look at pretty soon looking at changing design criteria in building codes to assume a higher level of sea level rise in groundwater. We can design for adaptability. So any projects we put in place now, they should be adaptable for those future changing conditions, especially because there are some conditions near the end of the century that we can't, fully crystal ball. There is some uncertainty there. So, and then in terms of retreat needs, again, looking at what do we want to do with those assets that are outside of our levees? How do we protect that habitat? So in summary, while we have several sea level rise protection efforts already underway, we do need to have that integrated plan that considers not just sea level rise inundation, but our groundwater considerations. And I hope you will join me for that planning effort in the year ahead. Our next steps are to complete the groundwater peer review and then release the report in the weeks ahead. We will be meeting again with our community throughout this year to put together a plan and then to bring that plan to our city council in early 2023. And then we will implement that plan and we will continue to update it in alignment with updates to the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, and also to make sure we continue to be in sync with state guidance for sea level rise heights. So thank you very much. Again, we hope that you will join us for the planning effort in the year ahead, and I welcome any questions that you have.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeremy and Julie. I'm going to turn it back to the ad hoc committee members now.
Allison, would you like to go first?
I would. Thanks so much. You know, this topic worries me because my neighbors and I live in that blue section. You know, my neighbors already, we all pay flood insurance already, and you know, it's concerning. In the same way we worry about many of the other things, the impacts of climate change. So I'm super grateful, Jeremy, that you could join us again. I think you have a unique ability to describe this in a way that helps people understand the science and also see what could happen. So I appreciate you being here. And Ms. Weiss, you know, what great improvements we've made. I wonder if you could just pop up slide 25 again. I'm interested in part 2. And I'm just going to quote you: "We don't have time to waste." I feel like that's probably the tagline for this entire effort of the SCAP. But I think what's important on slide 25, section 2, is these are what I would describe as the next actions we need to be taking. And I'm wondering if you anticipate, I realize you're clicking through all these here at the same time. Sorry. It's just, that was the helpful part about.
I'm trying, sorry. It's a little bit difficult to navigate this right now. I will get to there though.
No worries. I was just going to say that looks to be the part that, you know, you're going to ask council to take action on. And I think it's good to be foreshadowing that. You know, we're going to be asking people to make changes to any new construction in this area. And we're going to have to think about retrofitting probably some places. So it's fine. You don't have to show it. I know we've only got about a half hour left, and I'm sure that members of the public might want to weigh in on one of these topics. So I just want to say that as we build the case for the community about the changes that we need to make individually and collectively, this is a really important part of the story. And I think those maps really help. They help people visualize the changes. And so I just appreciate it. And I won't take any more time here. I'll turn it over to Pat and then Brad to let and then the members of the working group and the public weigh in. Thank you both for being here.
Yeah, I just also want to echo the how informative and valuable these presentations have been. One of the things that just strikes me again, just like on our last discussion on fire, is the question of how we move beyond this 120 people today, who is an incredible turnout, to the really much broader community and even our leadership on the city council and elsewhere, who really haven't been exposed to most of this information yet. I know that the staff is planning on coming forward with the our sea level rise protection plan that Julie was presenting, and I think that'll be very valuable. But I think we've really got to figure out how we move beyond this group who is already focused on this and hungry for information and really get it out there. So that's one of the topics I'm going to be interested in from some of our working group advisors and the public to wade in on. And that's all I have for the moment. Thanks.
Okay, well, again, let's let the working group members have a chance to weigh in. Debbie, I see your hand raised.
Good morning. Thank you for this program today. It's been very, very informative. And it really is wonderful to see the extent to which the city staff has really been thinking about both the wildfire and the sea level rise issues. I really appreciate learning about it. And I hope more, it's great there's so many people out listening today too. It's also been great to hear from the experts at Stanford and SFEI. So thank you for bringing those folks in too. I wanted to let you know, I'd seen a really good presentation by Len Matterman, who is the former director of the San Francisco Creek JPA. Some of you may know of him because of that. He's now managing the One Shoreline program for San Mateo County. And what he's been doing is working together with all the cities that are adjacent on the Bay Shore to get them to come up with mutual plans to support each other and basically create one levee up in San Mateo County to deal with all the issues, not just a levee necessarily, but to be planning in a coordinated way. And I'm wondering what extent we are coordinating with our neighbors to the north, Menlo Park and East Palo Alto, and to the south, Mountain View, and how we're coordinating down into Santa Clara County, because the bay doesn't stop at the county line, of course. So that's an important thing we need to sort of additionally learn about. I also think it's really been good to see, like the pictures that Julie showed about the lifting up of some of the essential facilities out at the water treatment plant to be sure that they're above where the mean high tide line might be if there was a storm or something. And last, I'd just like to call attention to everyone, the comment that was made by Judith Schwartz and the questions about the one electrical transmission line from PG&E that comes into Palo Alto, and to recognize that's an essential piece of facility. I didn't see it on the list of city facilities that we were paying attention to. I think one of the staff members said it is being paid attention to, but I think that's something we all need to know and be aware of as well. So thank you again for the presentation. It's really been very informative.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm looking to see if any other hands from working group members at this time. And not seeing any of those. And in the interest of time, we've got 23 minutes.
Can I interrupt for just 1 second?
Of
I
course.
think staff could probably respond to Debbie Mitel's first question about how are we working in Santa Clara County, the SAFER 2, maybe just a little bit more explanation of how we're partnering, I think would be helpful.
Sure. I can turn to Michelle Jeremias, our senior engineer, who's kind of point on collaborating with Valley Water and the Corps of Engineers for a quick update there.
Hi, my name is Michelle Jeremiah. Sorry, I was answering a couple of questions on the chat. So we are working with Valley Water, our partner agencies, through the JPA. We have a multiple agency project, Valley Water, the JPA, Menlo Park, East Palo Alto. The project on Shoreline Phase 2 is primarily spearheaded by Valley Water. The project is working with the Army Corps of Engineers to evaluate flooding risks and evaluate what measures could be implemented in different levee alignments along the Palo Alto Baylands.
Thank you. Yeah.
Michelle, does that also involve Mountain View? I think that's the
partly, yes. So partly we are working with also Mountain View's one of the players.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Valley Water's project really is looking at the entire shoreline in Santa Clara County.
Great.
With a current focus in our area. Okay, so with that, I think we're going to turn to general public comments. So if you'd like to comment, please raise your hand and we will call on you.
Brad, I'm not seeing
A bit
any.
of not seeing any yet of unusual reticence from this crowd for these meetings.
I would
Okay.
attribute that to staff and our speakers' responses in line in the Q&A. Perhaps
Sorry.
people are getting their questions answered that
So
way.
we have one hand, Jennifer Hetterly. I will allow you to talk.
Hi, thanks. I was furiously typing into the chat and I figured it would be quicker just to ask it directly. I'm curious, with new projects moving forward, like the transitional housing project and potential for Valley Water's water purification project on that Los Altos treatment plant site, which does seem to sit in the flood zone. With those moving forward, sort of in advance of adaptation planning for sea level rise, I wonder how the city is going to build in their learnings from the vulnerability assessment and make sure we're not putting more vital infrastructure in harm's way.
Well, I'll answer and just say that even in advance of the sea level rise plan, we do have a sea level rise policy that was previously approved by council, and that encourages projects that could be at risk to incorporate sea level rise. So we're working really closely with both the entities there, looking at those current elevations. And while we don't have regulatory requirements at this time to fully incorporate sea level rise, I think both those projects are looking at raising elevations and trying to add some protection from sea level rise.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our next speaker is Jason. Jason, are you able to talk?
All right, sorry about that. It seems like across these different areas, whether it's in saying, how do we be more resilient in homes and have them have better envelopes for controlling air quality and also doing filtration, and then also for home building, how we make them resilient around flooding and water and such. I wonder if is there a thread to ease permitting and purchasing and all the sets of things that homeowners will have to do, or that we would want them to do, to sort of do the right thing? Because if we say there's like an 8 to 10 year dramatic transformation required in how we heat and manage the safety of our homes through air quality and all this, it's a recurring theme that I keep hearing from others, is just the difficulty level being very, very high, and it seems like that's not going to fix itself. So is there a process, a optimized path we can get to say there's a group of people looking at what is hard for people to do and how do we make it less hard for them to do so that we can then have them smoothly every time their hot water heater blows up, or they want to replace their dryer, or they want to do something else, that we can get them to do the things, make it easy for them to do the things we'd like to have them do.
So I think we can mostly take that as a comment that we've been hearing a lot about, but I will just respond to say that's permitting and planning for electrification. This area is definitely something that we're talking about a lot as we try to make plans for building electrification. And we're thinking about how to make that more efficient in the future as we try to ramp these areas up and make it essentially easy for people. And there are efforts going on right now with our Planning and Development Services Department, and working in concert with utilities, the fire department, and discussions that have been happening at the Utilities Advisory Commission on efforts right now to try to smooth out those permitting processes.
And Brad, if I might just add to that, this is a big focus of what staff and this committee is looking at, and we're very much looking at the model that Carbon-Free Palo Alto had proposed of focusing on end of life, identifying imminent end of life of appliances and pre-permitting and all the things that would go into easing that, so that we basically make it really easy and the norm for no more gas based appliances to be replacing existing ones or to be installed as new ones. And it's a complex matter, but it's a great deal of this, the focus of all these folks.
Yeah, I'll just say, Jason, I'm not sure if this makes you feel better or worse. This is a known problem. So we appreciate you adding to the chorus of people who say it needs to be fixed.
Our next public comment is from Charlie Johnson. Charlie. Are you there, Charlie? Or Charles, sorry, Charles Johnson. Okay, let's try. The next presenter is, or the commenter is Henry Hoffman.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, my name is Henry Hoffman. I'm a policy fellow at Save the Bay. I posted a question in the chat, but I was just curious. Burlingame recently passed a sea level rise zoning ordinance, which does a couple of things, but forces new development to account for 3 feet of sea level rise and elevating the first floor elevation. And I was curious if there was something similar that was being thought about in Palo Alto, or if Palo Alto was thinking about adopting a similar ordinance.
I'll take a crack there just to say that I don't think we're currently looking at adopting a similar ordinance, but actions like that are exactly what we want to consider through the sea level rise plan that we're about to embark on. Thanks for pointing that out. I hadn't heard about the Burlingame ordinance, but I think we'll want to go look that up.
Charles Johnson, would you like to try again and unmute yourself? Okay, well, I don't see any other hands.
Okay, well, I think we turn back to Mayor Burt and Councilmember Cormack for any closing comments or thoughts for today.
You know, these topics can be scary. I think we've all acknowledged that. But we've also come away with things that we can do today and in the next year and in the next 10 years. I'm reassured, you know, when I see the sort of timelines on the sea level rise. The wildfire part is, you know, little harder, scarier to sort of work our ways back from. But what I think will be important for us collectively, as we work with our neighbors to help them understand that they have to make these changes and they'll be expensive and disruptive and it will take time, is that this is part of the story, right? These two topics today are not the whole story, but they're part of the story. That's what I've been thinking about this morning is how do we explain this? And I think what's good about these is that there are things that affect people and we can show them, you know, the photos of, you know, that horrible day when the sky was orange and, you know, the map as the water comes in, to help people understand, you know, why we need to make these changes. And I think these visuals are always more, they help people make change in a way that numbers just don't. The data is incredibly important. We must start with it, but then we have to translate it into something that helps people see the changes that we all need to make. So I'm, you know, super grateful to our staff that's been working on sea level rise. They're, In the same way we hear urgency on residential electrification, the mayor and I have been on an email chain with people who are still like, why are we still paying for flood insurance? Why can't we just put up the levees? And it's a complicated answer. So appreciate the time we've taken today, and we need to incorporate these into why we need to basically get the gas out. We have to get the gas out of the city. So, and we don't have time to waste, as Ms. Weiss said.
Yeah, I'll just add, we've had some really great meetings of this SCAP committee over the last 6 months or so. But this one for me was probably the most informative that we've had so far, and startling in many ways. But I think what we're seeing is real momentum building. And I think everybody on this webinar has a shared sense of the urgency. But what we have to figure out is how we translate our sense of urgency into a broader understanding that will help us achieve the real actions that we're all aiming for. And I'm just feeling that we're gaining a lot of speed, and that the people who are participating at all levels on this call and otherwise are really valuable resources that we appreciate not only you joining us, but that what we anticipate, what we're going to get from you in terms of being people who help us achieve these ends. And so I'm just really pleased at how many people joined us today, and I'm assuming everybody had similar takeaways about what startling and critical impacts we're already facing. So thanks to everybody.
Okay. Well, thanks again to all of our presenters today for a really good conversation, and to all the members of the public who attended. And we hope to see you next month. And with that, I think we will close the meeting out.